The silence of the Idaho foothills was a heavy blanket Elias Vance had wrapped around himself for years. It was a silence of his own choosing, a buffer against a world that had taken too much from him. He was sitting on his porch, as he did most afternoons, a cold cup of coffee in his hand, his gaze lost in the sea of sagebrush and lodgepole pine that rolled toward the jagged teeth of the Ironwood Range. Then, the silence broke. It wasn't a gentle interruption, but a violent shattering. A tremendous crash followed by the sickening sound of splintering wood and a high, sharp whinny of pure terror that was cut off abruptly. "Good grief," Elias muttered, the words rough and unfamiliar in his throat. His old bones protested with the chorus of aches as he pushed himself up from his chair. That came from the direction of the old paddock, a place he hadn't had the heart or the need to maintain since his son, Michael, had left this earth. He shuffled toward the sound, his boots kicking up little puffs of dust. When he reached the broken fence line, he stopped dead. "Holy smokes," he breathed, the air leaving his lungs in a rush. There, lying in the wreckage of splintered posts and tangled wire, was a horse. But to call it just a horse felt like a blasphemy. It was a colossal, dappled gray stallion, a creature of such immense raw power that even in its broken state, it commanded awe. His coat, the color of storm clouds and granite, was lathered in sweat and streaked with ugly, dark lines of blood. His massive sides heaved, each breath a ragged, desperate struggle. The stallion's eyes, wide and rolling, held a universe of pain, and a terror so profound it struck a chord deep within Elias's own hollowed-out chest. This was no domestic animal. This was a force of nature, brought low. Elias's mind, usually a fog of regret and memory, sparked with a sudden, startling clarity. He knew this horse. Not personally, but from the whispers in the general store, the tall tales swapped by firelight. The locals didn't speak of him with the casual tone used for livestock. They spoke of him in hushed, reverent tones. The Ironwood Ghost, a phantom, a spirit of the high country who had evaded every trap, outrun every helicopter, and defied every rancher for a solid decade. He was a legend, a symbol of the untamable wild that still clung to the mountains. And here he was, dethroned, dying in the dust of an old man's broken-down field. The irony was as bitter as Elias's morning coffee. For a long moment, he just stared, paralyzed by the sheer scale of the tragedy before him. He was a retired farrier, a man who had once spoken the language of hooves and sinew, but that was a lifetime ago. That man had died with his son in the car crash that had spared only Elias, leaving him with a body full of aches and a soul full of ghosts. "Blast it all," he whispered, not at the horse, but at the unwelcome surge of feeling rising in him. He had turned his back on this world, on the responsibility of caring for another living soul. But to walk away now, to let this magnificent spirit be extinguished out of sheer apathy, he found he couldn't do it. An old, stubborn instinct, long buried under grief, kicked in. He had to try. "Whoa, boy, easy now, easy." His voice was a rusty gate, grating and unfamiliar. The stallion flinched violently at the sound, a shudder of pure panic rippling through his 1,200-pound frame. His head thrashed, and a low groan of agony rumbled from his chest. Elias moved with a slowness that was part caution, part physical limitation. He held out his gnarled, weathered hands, showing them to be empty, making himself small and non-threatening. He didn't look the horse directly in the eye, instead keeping his gaze soft, on his neck. He saw the wire cuts thin, deep and angry, slicing across the gray hide, and he saw something else beneath the terror, a flicker of defiant, unbroken will. It was a refusal to surrender that Elias recognized, a mirror of his own stubborn existence. It was a language he understood all too well. Somehow, with a strength he didn't know he possessed, he managed to loop a soft rope around the stallion's neck, not to lead, but to guide. With a groan that came from the depths of his own weary spirit, He encouraged the giant to his feet. Step by painful step, they moved toward the old barn, a cavernous structure that smelled of dust, dried hay, and forgotten dreams. "Well, I'll be," Elias muttered as they crossed the threshold. He was back in it, the world of life and pain and responsibility. He had just volunteered for a burden he wasn't sure he could carry. Inside, under the dim light filtering through the cracked boards, Elias got a better look. The gash on the shoulder was deep, probably from a sharp branch during his blind flight, and it was festering, hot to the touch. But the other marks, "Geez Louise," he breathed, his blood running cold. These were no accidental scrapes. They were the precise, cruel lines of barbed wire. Fresh, too. Someone hadn't just tried to catch the ghost. They had tried to ensnare him, to cut him down with a deliberate, malicious intent. This wasn't the work of the Bureau of Land Management. This was something darker. As the horse, whom he now mentally named Granite for his unyielding strength in storm cloud color, slept fitfully, Elias pieced together the legend. The ghost kingdom was the vast, roadless wilderness of the Ironwood primitive area. His herd was small, maybe a dozen mares and their offspring, and they were as elusive as mist. He was a master of his domain, knowing every hidden seep, every canyon that could swallow sound, every ridge that offered a vantage point for miles. A king without a crown, answerable to nothing but the weather and his own instincts. But the world had been changing at the foot of his kingdom. A new corporate hunting outfit, Summit Peak Outfitters, had bought up a patchwork of old grazing leases. They catered to wealthy clients who paid a fortune to trophy hunt elk and mule deer. They didn't see the wild horses as a symbol of freedom. They saw them as competitors for grass and water, as unpredictable elements that could spook their prized game. Their leader was a man named Jeb Hawk Hawkins, a figure as sharp and predatory as his namesake. He had declared the ghost a problem and had publicly vowed to solve it. Hawk's men had started with intimidation. They used fleets of roaring ATVs and souped-up side-by-sides to run the herds, to fracture their cohesion, to drain their spirit. Granite had outrun them with ease, his powerful legs eating up the miles. But the constant mechanical noise was a violation of his world. It terrified his mares and wore down the younger, weaker members of the herd. I could almost hear the stallion's defiant snort. They thought noise and speed would break him. It only honed his edge, making him more paranoid, more fiercely protective. When herding failed, Hawk resorted to treachery. They had studied the ghost. They knew his routes, the secret paths he used to move his herd between water and safety. In a narrow, rocky gully that was the only access to a spring during the dry season, they had strung new barbed wire, taut and nearly invisible, across the trail at neck and leg height. "Oh, for crying out loud," Elias whispered, the image forming painfully in his mind. It was a coward's move. Granite, leading his family at a confident trot, would have hit the wire with the full force of his momentum. The pain must have been blinding, the betrayal absolute. But a king does not fall easily. Enraged, panicked, and in a searing pain, he had thrashed and reared, the barbs tearing deeper into his flesh with every movement. He'd torn himself free, leaving strands of his own hide and hair on the wire. He'd run then, driven by a primal need to escape the source of his agony. He ran for miles, his world reduced to a red haze of pain, his great heart hammering against his ribs, until the last of his strength was spent and he collapsed through Elias Vance's fence. He had run himself to the very brink of death, his final act of defiance leading him to the one place he might be saved. Elias didn't sleep that first night. He worked by the dim glow of a hanging lantern. His hands, though scarred and stiff, remembering their old craft. He cleaned the wire wounds with a meticulous care, clipping away the matted hair, flushing out the dirt, applying salve. He administered a powerful antibiotic from his dwindling veterinary kit and set up an IV to drip fluids into the dehydrated body. Granite was too weak to offer more than a token resistance, his spirit seemingly as battered as his body. Every flinch, every shuddering breath felt like a judgment on Elias's own self-imposed exile. "Good Lord," he murmured, wiping sweat from his brow, "the sheer will to live in you." Days blurred into a week. Elias named him Granite, officially, a name that spoke to his strength and his enduring spirit. He'd spent hours sitting on an upturned bucket in the stall, not speaking, just being a quiet, consistent presence. He'd hum old country tunes, the same ones he'd hummed to Michael when he was a boy. It was a one-sided conversation, an offering of peace. Then, one quiet afternoon, as Elias was carefully applying a fresh poultice, Granite, without even opening his eyes, slowly shifted his great head and rested his heavy muzzle on the old man's worn leather boots. It wasn't a nuzzle, not quite. It was a weight, a surrender, a silent communication that said, "I accept you. I trust you." "Wow," Elias whispered, a lump forming in his throat. It was the first crack in the dam of his own grief. The peace of the ranch was shattered by the unfamiliar growl of a modern, dust-covered SUV. A woman with a determined look in her eyes and a pair of high-powered binoculars around her neck stepped out. Dr. Aris Thorne, a wildlife biologist from the State University. She'd been studying the Ironwood herd for her PhD, tracking them, documenting their social structure. "Elias Vance?" she said, her voice a mix of awe and disbelief as she saw him emerge from the barn. "I heard a rumor at the diner. I've been tracking his signal for days. I can't believe it. You're the one who found him." "Well, shut my mouth," Elias grunted. The outside world had found them. Aris confirmed Elias's darkest suspicions. Hawk's outfit was not just a nuisance, they were a real and present danger. She showed Elias photos on her camera of the wire snares she'd found and cut down, of the herds being harassed by vehicles. She brought with her stronger, more modern medicines and a deep well of scientific knowledge, but she was smart enough to see the magic at work in Elias's barn. She deferred to his quiet, grounded wisdom, his innate understanding of the equine soul. An unlikely trio was formed: the reclusive old man, the driven young scientist, and the ghost of a horse who was slowly becoming real. As Granite's body healed, his true personality began to shine through the layers of pain and fear. He was devilishly clever. Elias came out one morning to find the stall door unlatched and Granite standing placidly in the barn aisle, looking immensely pleased with himself. He learned to hide his bitter pills in a cheek and spit them out later when he thought no one was looking. "Good grief, you're a character, aren't you?" Elias found himself saying, a rough, unexpected laugh escaping his lips. It was a sound he hadn't heard in years. The horse wasn't just healing Elias's body by giving him a purpose. He was mending his spirit with these small, joyful interactions. The day came when Granite was strong enough to be led into the small, secure pasture. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. This was the moment of truth. What if the call of the wild was too strong? What if he saw the open sky and the distant mountains and simply ran, crashing through the fences, re-injuring himself? But Granite walked slowly to the center of the enclosure, his head held high. He sniffed the air, his nostrils flaring,
taking in the sense of his home range. He turned a full circle, his gaze sweeping the horizon. Then he turned and looked directly at Elias, who was holding his breath by the gate. He let out a soft, blowing sound, lowered his head, and began to graze on the fresh, green grass. Wow, Elias breathed, a wave of relief and something akin to love washing over him. He had chosen to stay. Of course, it couldn't last. A week later, a gleaming, too-clean pickup truck pulled up and Jab Hawkins himself stepped out. He was all smiles and snakeskin boots, his eyes as cold and calculating as a predator's. "Here you got yourself a trophy, old-timer," he drawled, his voice slick as oil. "That there is a dangerous pest, been destroying my clients' hunts for years. I've got a state permit to cull problem feral horses. I'm doing you a favor by taking it off your hands." My word, Elias thought, his stomach tightening. The gall of the man was breathtaking. Elias, who hadn't stood up to anyone since the funeral director tried to sell him an overly ornate casket, felt a fire ignite in his belly. He straightened his stooped shoulders, and when he spoke, his voice was low and carried a steel that surprised even him. "He's not a pest," Elias said, his eyes locked on Hawk's. "And he's not yours. He walked onto my private land of his own accord. He's staying here by his own choice." Hawk's smile didn't falter, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We'll see what the law says about that, old-timer."
And so the battle was joined. Hawk, with his deep pockets and slick lawyers, filed injunctions. He argued the feral horse was a destructive invasive species on public land, and that its presence on Elias's property was a temporary fluke, not a change of status. He produced blurry photos claiming Granite's herd was overgrazing sensitive areas. Elias and Aris fought back. They gathered affidavits from other ranchers who respected the wild herds. They presented Aris's scientific data on the herd's sustainable size, and they argued passionately that Granite had found a permanent sanctuary and was now a resident animal protected by the laws governing private property. The case became a local sensation, a symbol of the Old West clashing with the new. "Geez," Elias would grumble, reading the legal documents. "All this fuss over one horse's right to exist?" Hawk, frustrated by the slow grind of the legal system, decided to force the issue. One of his men, a weaselly-faced character, pretended to be a volunteer from a horse rescue, gaining access to the property under false pretenses. That night, he slipped back, armed with a high-powered tranquilizer dart gun. His plan was to sedate Granite and haul him away, creating a fait accompli. But he had underestimated the stallion's wild-honed senses and the depth of the bond he shared with Elias. The man had barely crept into the pasture when Granite sounded the alarm, a piercing, furious whinny that tore through the quiet night and shot Elias from a dead sleep. Holy smokes! Elias grabbed his old shotgun from the rack and burst out of the house. The confrontation was short and terrifying. The intruder, faced with a very awake, very angry old man and a thrashing, enraged legend of a horse, dropped his dart gun and fled into the darkness. The attempted theft made the front page of the local paper and forced a judge's hand. The presiding judge, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia Williams, decided to visit the Vance Ranch to see the situation for herself. She didn't announce her visit. She simply drove up one afternoon and watched from her car. She saw Elias walk into the pasture with a bucket of oats. She saw Granite amble over, not with the skittishness of a wild animal, but with the calm expectation of a family pet. She saw him lower his magnificent head and gently lip the oats from Elias's hand, then stand perfectly still as the old man scratched the base of his mane, a place he could never reach himself. She saw the trust, a bond that was palpable and undeniable. Ha, Elias thought later, having been informed of her visit. He knew what she had seen. Let Hawk's lawyers try to argue against that. The final court hearing was brief. Judge Williams looked over the courtroom. The law often struggles with the classification of animals. They are property, yes, but they are also living, feeling beings. The evidence presented by the defense, particularly the first-hand observation of the relationship between Mr. Vance and the stallion, is compelling. This animal is not a wild pest running loose. He is a resident of a private sanctuary, receiving care and, it is abundantly clear, choosing to remain there. Mr. Hawkins' permit for population control on public land does not extend to the removal of a privately held and cared for animal. The injunction is denied. The horse stays. "Oh, thank heavens," Aris whispered, squeezing Elias's arm. The old man just nodded, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on his cheek. The victory was more than legal. It was spiritual. News of the old man and the ghost spread like wildfire. Elias's ranch, once a place of retreat from life, became a beacon for it. People started bringing him injured animals, a blind ewe, a lamb rejected by its mother, a dog hit by a car. And Granite, the once solitary monarch, became their gentle, stoic guardian. He was calm and patient, his immense presence a balm to the other frightened creatures. He would stand for hours, letting the blind ewe lean against his warm flank. "Well, I'll be darned," Elias said, watching the once untouchable king of the Ironwood gently nuzzle a newborn lamb. The most miraculous thing happened one crisp autumn morning. Elias looked out to the high ridge that formed the western boundary of his land. And there they were, 4 of Granite's original mares standing in a line like sentinels, their silhouettes sharp against the dawn sky. They had found their king. Granite saw them, trotted to the high point of the pasture, and called out, a long, rolling whinny that echoed through the valley. The mares called back, but then Granite turned and walked back towards the barn, towards Elias. He did not try to jump the fence. He had one family on the ridge and another here. He had become a bridge between the wild and the tame, a king with 2 kingdoms. Hawk, frustrated and publicly humiliated, found his wealthy clients going elsewhere. The notoriety of the case had made him and his outfit pariahs in the conservation-minded hunting community. He sold his operation at a loss and left the state, his venomous presence gone from the mountain. The wilderness grew quiet again, the way Granite remembered it. His legend, however, was rewritten. He was no longer the untouchable ghost, but the guardian of the Ironwood, his official territory now encompassing both the high country and the Vance sanctuary. Inspired and with a new lease on life, Elias started a small, informal program. He connected with the local youth outreach center and began taking in a few troubled teenagers. He wouldn't force them to talk. He'd simply put them in the pasture with Granite. "Don't look him in the eye," he'd instruct. "Just sit. Be still. Let him decide." And the horse, who understood trauma and the long road to healing better than any human therapist, would always eventually amble over. He would stand with them, his breathing slow and deep, his massive body radiating a calm, accepting power that seemed to soak up their anxiety and anger. "Wow," one of the kids finally said after a long silence, tears in his eyes. "He just gets it." The legend lived on, not in fear, but in healing. One evening, Elias stood with Aris on the porch, watching Granite and his mares on the ridge. The stallion was a solid gray silhouette against the fiery sunset. "You know," Aris said softly, breaking the comfortable silence, "we set out to study him, to save him, but he saved all of us, didn't he? He gave you a reason to live again, and he gave me a cause to fight for." Elias didn't speak for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the horse. Finally, he just nodded, a quiet, heartfelt, "Yep," his only reply. The gratitude was a river, too deep for words. Granite's story became a testament to the power of choice. He was the wild spirit who chose to be gentle, the king who chose to be a guardian, the ghost who chose to be seen. He proved that the greatest freedom isn't merely the absence of fences, but the presence of unshakable trust.
His legend is still whispered on the wind that sweeps down from the Ironwood Range, a enduring reminder that sometimes the most wounded among us, whether man or beast, possess the greatest capacity to heal others, and that true strength lies in the courage to lower your defenses and accept a helping hand.